So we are going to try to answer really three big questions here. The first is how to choose topics at the real heart of your expertise. And that's really in particular in contrast to say sort of like choosing topics at the far reaches of your relevance or where you're really not an expert. The second is to figure out, okay, if we know what we want to cover, how do we cover this way in a way that's really authoritative, that really builds credibility, that's something that we would say is really like brand building content, not just kind of meeting the minimum standard that we might need to show up on page one, but the stuff that really resonates. And the last thing is to say, okay, if we want to do this, we can find these great topics. If we know how we want to do this, how do we also do it within the budgets that we have? Because a lot of us have great content ideas that also happen to take a year to produce, require 5 full-time developers, 10 full-time designers, and an army of writers, and those just aren't practical. We want to make sure that even once we kind of establish what we want to talk about, how we want to frame it, that we're also giving ourselves a chance to actually execute that successfully, that we can scale it in various ways based on the resources that we have. When we start talking about choosing a topic at the heart of our expertise, the question that I'm absolutely guilty of this, especially historically, the questions that we usually ask but probably shouldn't when it comes to defining a topic is, hey, what can we rank for? Given where our site is today, what topics can we cover that reasonably we could show up on page one of search results pretty soon? Because that might be our best way to get visibility. And then so at the same time, we might say, oh, what has the most search volume? If we find, say, 50 different topics or 50 keywords where we think we can rank for something, which one of those has the highest search volume? And that becomes kind of the temptation to go after the thing that can make this lovely little up and to the right in Google Analytics. And then the other thing we sometimes do is say, okay, what is our broadest relevance? And I know that no one has ever actually sat in a meeting and said, what is our broadest relevance? But in some ways, it's kind of what can we get away with? So if we're thinking about Richmond, right? So if we think about the James River and it's like, maybe parks along the James River, what if we found out that that was a keyword that was reasonably not too competitive, has some decent search volume, and we say to ourselves, oh, we're Workshop Digital, how could we write content about parks around the James River? And we think, well, we have people that are kind of outdoorsy, so maybe we could do something like that. You can see where we're starting to stretch our expertise. We have no expertise in the park system, right? The park system, an NGO that maybe helps protect or clean up the park, they would have that expertise. But that's really the temptation when we start at this kind of level of choosing topics for content marketing, that we end up in these really bad spots where we're not experts, and we're just kind of going after anything that we can grab. And so this really is the reality that we tend to see with this kind of strategy, right? But the outcome is, if we're going to publish content, if we do what can we rank for, it ends up being a hodgepodge of sort of low difficulty keywords. There's no continuity from one day to the next on our blog, or from one week to the next. It's just one topic after another that happens to be the one that we maybe unearthed in some keyword research. What has the most search volume? Well, that is great for the up and to the right, but a lot of times those aren't relevant visitors. I would be the first to tell you, totally guilty of, we've driven some tremendous amounts of traffic to websites that looks incredible in Google Analytics, as 3-4 digit year-over-year gains, but those visitors are completely irrelevant. They might be located completely out of your service area, completely out of your service country. And that's one of the challenges there. And then again, with this broadest relevance issue is we often end up producing a lot of content where we're really not experts. We don't really know what we're talking about. And so obviously, how do you create authoritative brand building content if you're not even really an expert involved in that content creation? So these are the traditional pitfalls. They should probably feel somewhat familiar to a lot of us. They certainly feel familiar to me. But one of the temptations is that, as we said, this definitely can work. This is actually a screenshot from one of these examples where we kind of followed this really basic strategy and we saw tremendous results. But the reality is those tremendous results were tremendous results for a while. Because what ultimately ended up happening here, you can see at the end, this is a massive drop, of almost 2/3 of the traffic. And the reason was simply because Google is looking for experts. Google is desperately trying to surface in search results, even though it does it imperfectly. It's desperately looking for people who are experts. And if our blog is just a hodgepodge of random topics, we're not going to establish that expertise. And so eventually, either as Google's algorithm gets smarter, or other competitors who are experts start producing that content, inevitably they're going to come to that space. They're going to take those places, and we're never, ever, ever getting them back. And so that's one of the things to remember is it might look great right now, but as soon as that expert comes into your space and does a much better job covering this stuff, you're gone and you're not getting back up there. So it's very fragile traffic. There are better questions, however, that we can ask. So the first one is really not what can we rank for, but what should we rank for? What if you sat down with your team and said, what should we really rank for? What do we really own? What is another way to frame this is sort of how narrowly can we define our expertise instead of trying to constantly stretch it? and to constantly push at the fringes of it because maybe that's where we see an opportunity to gain some traffic in organic search, how much more narrowly can we establish that expertise? And my sort of favorite question that this tends to land on is, what's the one question that we're best able to answer? This is a great starting point. Not what are the 10 questions we could answer, but what is that one question where we really say we have this expertise, however far we have to niche down, this is our expertise, this is our space that we can own and should own. That's a best possible starting point for a content strategy. And just because it's one question that you're able to answer doesn't mean that it's only one article that you can write. Usually that becomes the sort of the center of gravity around a lot of content that you can create. And this is exactly what Google is begging us really to do. These are the questions that they really want us to answer. And you can look even in their quality rater guidelines, which is, these are basically a big PDF they give to actual humans who they want to go in and evaluate certain websites. And then look and say, okay, humans said this website was of this quality level, and our algorithm is ranking them at this level. Is there a match here? That's what they're doing this process for. And you've probably heard about EAT, or expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness, but this is really what they're asking for. And when you look down there, the MC is main content, so sort of the main body of the page. They're saying, is this creator an expert? Is the creator an expert? Is the content expert content? Is the website dedicated to this kind of topic? Is it trustworthy, right? So this is really what they're pushing us to do. And even though they reward it imperfectly now and we can get away with a lot of stuff, the long-term success is absolutely going to be leaning into what they're asking us to do. And so I want to give you an example of kind of what this looks like in the real world. Run your sort of a pretend hat for a second, and you can imagine that you run a group of urgent care clinics. This is an example from a number of years ago. Imagine you run a group of urgent care clinics. What could you create content on? Right? Technically, you might think about a lot of different things like, okay, we could talk about nutrition, we could talk about like child proofing because that's safety, you could talk about health insurance. All these things are technically relevant to what you do, right? If we talk about stretching that broadest relevance, all these things are in there. But you can imagine how quickly, if you're publishing content, how much this becomes a scattershot, right? One week you're talking about car seat safety, the next week you're talking about how to get kids to eat more vegetables, the next week you're talking about choosing the right health insurance plan, right? There's no continuity, there's no creation of this kind of core center of expertise. And in this case, the reality was the people who ran these urgent care clinics had previously been physicians in emergency departments. So they had been on the other side of this, where they had been in emergency departments. Now they were in urgent care. And so the one question they were really best positioned to answer was that sort of in the moment question, if for you or as a parent, that should I go to urgent care or the ER? Which one of these do I need to go to right now based on what's happening right now? And what are sort of the consequences of that decision? That was the one question that they were best positioned to answer. And that wasn't even every urgent care place could answer that. That was specific to them because of their past experience. And so from that one question, we were able to develop a handful of different articles like, hey, can you get stitches at urgent care? What kind of stitches? Can you get x-rays? These kind of in the moment questions that people would have, right? When is a fever dangerous? These are the kind of core questions, and these all came back to that central idea. And the benefits from only a handful of articles, this was not some massive like years long thing. For only a handful of articles and really competitive search results, they got really great performance out of this. And this is, if you're not familiar with how search results work, anything related to health, Google is very picky about, because they can't have somebody Googling symptoms of a heart attack and their answer is totally wrong. So they're very picky. They spend a lot of time making sure this content is right. And I promise for anybody on this call right now, this was not a massive, super powerful website that was able to leapfrog, sites like WebMD or Mayo Clinic or that kind of thing because it was a huge website. I would bet that anyone on this call right now, your website is as sort of strong or stronger in an organic search perspective than this client was. And yet they were able to generate these really tremendous results because they had that really centralized, focused expertise in the way that they chose their topics. Now, when it comes to sort of what do we do now, if we're going to say we're going to choose topics sort of agnostic of what the search potential might be, when does that come back into play? And the reality is you can use search volume 1 to adjust the framing of a topic. So 1 to say, okay, we know this is the topic that we really want to talk about, but to ask that question of how, when people talk about this or ask search engines about this, how are they putting this into search engines and asking about it? What words are they using? And then also to set expectations so that we know that if we're choosing this strategy, here's the potential outcome, best case scenario, and we're not creating mismatched expectations. And so in this case, a couple things that we did was you ask a physician anywhere, they're going to call it the ED, the emergency department, because that's what they call it in hospitals. None of us calls it that. So we switched everything to ER, right? If we're talking about, it's not, should I check, should I go to the ED, should I go to the ER? And the second one was, okay, infant is the official medical term. I think it's 9 or first 12 months of a child's life if they're an infant. Nobody's Googling, is a fever dangerous for my infant or what temperature is it? It's always baby, right? So we were able to use that search volume to kind of validate that, yes, this is what we're going to talk about, But here's how we should frame that just a little bit to make sure that it resonates with how people are asking about it online. And the other thing we do that right away, we could say, hey, look, this is the thing we should be talking about, but we're talking about bringing in hundreds, not thousands of visitors here. That's the expectations. And in this case, that worked. If this was their only distribution channel, if search was their only chance to get this content in front of them, in front of somebody, it may not make sense to say, okay, let's invest in creating these really, really strong, expert, long-form articles. But we knew that they also had a really strong Facebook following, so that they could also push this out on Facebook, which meant immediate results, right? Because we're not waiting for stuff to rank organically. They had that distribution channel of Facebook, so they could get stuff in front of people right away. And in total, that could supplement the total amount of traffic to help kind of justify this as a project. One other rabbit hole when we talk about topic selection before we move on to kind of how to approach this once you know what you want to talk about. A great rabbit hole to go down if you're really looking to feed a larger program that's going to be, we don't just want to kind of come up with these one-off topics. We want to be able to come up with 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 things that we could write about. Where are you an impartial expert? The last two words of that are the ones that are super important. One, impartial, and two, expert. There are a lot of places where we have expertise, but we can't be impartial, right? As speaking as like Workshop Digital, we can't really publish a blog post on how to choose, an SEO agency. We could, because we have some expertise there, but I don't think we'd have that credibility, because people would say, okay, yeah, you're writing this up, you're writing the pros and cons based on what you all think you do well and what you don't do. The other thing is obviously the expertise. We do want to stay close to that expertise, but where are we impartial? And so a good example of this kind of content that I did in my previous job for a company called CXL, which sells online marketing training. So we were really, really deep in analytics space, was comparing two analytics tools. We didn't make any money, whether you chose to use Mixpanel or whether you used Google Analytics. We didn't care. We were just here to tell you we can dig really deep into the business case. We can talk to people who are experts who've used both these platforms a bunch, and we can give you some really impartial information on this. And again, you can imagine these are two analytics platforms, right? There are dozens of analytics platforms out there. So this was something where we could basically create a framework and say we can do this 100 times over. So in the case of, again, because it's most familiar to me, if I think about Workshop Digital, what do? We're using tools all the time, tools for SEO research, tools for PPC research, tools for keyword research. That's a space where it'd be really easy for us to say, okay, we're going to crank out 20 different articles that do this really unbiased deep dive comparison that uses the expertise that we have on staff, but also uses that expertise, it's impartial expertise, because we don't really care whether you want to use Ahrefs or Moz for your research. We'll tell you the pros and cons of both. Of course, as we know, choosing a topic is only sort of 1/3 in this case of the challenge. And the other is, okay, even if we know what we want to talk about, how are we going to do this in a way that's going to stand out, knowing how crowded the market is right now for content? So the traditional methods here of how you stand out. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of 10x content. This was popularized by Rand Fishkin a long time ago, which was basically you can't just 2x what's out there, you have to 10x what's out there. And then Brian Dean of Backlinko did what he called the skyscraper technique, which was sort of grabbing everything that was out there and building an even taller building. The challenge with this made a lot of sense a few years ago. This made a lot of sense when you could easily be on the top of page one with a really short, poorly sourced article. That's not the case in 2021, and it's not going to be anytime soon either. So to give you a great example here, there are 99 results between these two articles. This is for the query, how to measure square footage. I don't think any of us can look at this and tell you which one is in position 1 and which one's on page 10. But you got to remember, there are at least 100 articles that are basically in the same ballpark of, yes, they're right, they have some illustrations, they have the simple formulas. This is what you're competing against. So if your idea is that, oh, we'll just skyscraper for this topic, there's nowhere to go. There are literally hundreds of results that are answering every little nuanced bit of user query here. So that's not going to be the solution anymore. And the best part about that for us is that, skyscraper is a technique, or 10x is a technique. It can be really expensive, right? Writing 4,000 words takes forever. So I really want to let us off the hook right away with saying, this is not going to be about you do brand building, authoritative content by, outwriting everybody else. That's not going to get us there anymore. So we can take sort of a collective deep breath. We do have to find other solutions. But this is the reality, and this is, not a super competitive query, but you can imagine for a really competitive query like, say how to write an email subject line, or how to choose an attorney. Some of these other ones that are going to be super competitive, you're going to be looking at hundreds and hundreds of results, all of which are pretty good. We're going to have to find a different way to succeed here. Differentiation is not about length; it's going to be about the approach, and this is going to be really important to think about as you move forward. Brand building content, authoritative content is going to be about having a unique voice in how you approach something, not just in the brute force that you approach it with. So unfortunately, if I look at content research tools, if I follow the best practices for content research, for how to create something new and different and special, they're not going to push me in that direction. All the sort of content tools out there, all the standard docs that you're going to look at, they're going to tell you what to do to figure out what angle you should take. They're going to really push you toward this sort of skyscraper 10x technique based on quantitative data. And I'm going to pick on BuzzSumo here a little bit. They're a tool that gives you information on shares and links. This is sort of exactly how they position it, right? So they're going to say, what you should do is go out and find the stuff that's earned the most links. Go out and find the stuff that's earned the most shares. Go out and find the stuff that has driven tons and tons of organic traffic. And then if you take the top characteristics that overlap among those three, you're going to end up doing the amazing 10x skyscraper version that's going to get you on page one. Unfortunately, even the data that we're getting from those sites really isn't very instructive for us anymore. Most link content tends to be content from sites that already had a ton of links. Or we can imagine right away that if you publish something on nytimes.com or forbes.com, that thing's going to earn links no matter what it is, even if it's lorem ipsum. Meanwhile, the extreme example I use is on my personal website. I could publish tomorrow's winning lottery numbers on there. I wouldn't have to split the winnings, right? So it's not always just about the raw number. It really depends on that specific site. And the same is true for social media following. BuzzFeed has how many million followers? Gary V on Twitter has a million followers. Whatever they push out, it's going to get retweets. It's going to get likes. And these content tools that we often use are going to surface that stuff to the top. They're going to keep servicing this stuff to us that really comes from really big websites, from really big accounts that already have an audience. And of course, the last component of this is that it sort of assumes that stuff that's keyword targeted is inherently good. Now, when we think about thought leadership content, we're not typically thinking about something where, oh, this is a space where people are already asking tons of questions about it. Thought leadership content tends to be the kind of thing that nobody's talking about yet. So again, it's going to miss out on all those things that don't have a keyword target, that aren't driving organic traffic, but are really valuable. So when you tell me that the sort of top content that I should emulate here is in the center, I'm really, really skeptical of that. And just to drive home the point here, if this is, in case anybody's still sort of like beloved way of doing work, I'd love to say that like nobody has the data that we really want. This is sort of an analytics joke, right? Usually these things say like shares, links, traffic, whatever. Nobody has, oh, this piece of content generated this number of leads, or it closed this number of deals, or generated this amount of money, this amount of revenue for a company. Nobody has that data, and they're never going to have it. So even if we're looking at really good data, which we're not, in these content research tools, those are really just proxy metrics. Those are really just micro conversions that don't necessarily tell us what content is going to be most valuable to us. So the takeaway from all this, I really want us to take it is look, quantitative data is not coming to save us. And again, this can maybe be scary because a lot of our processes might right now be based on using some quantitative data. And it's not that quantitative data is useless, but it's not coming to save us. It's not going to give us that unique angle that we really want to find to help differentiate ourselves. Again, the pro of this, the thing that's to be really excited about, is that quantitative data often means lots of time in spreadsheets, lots of money paid for different tools. There are ways that we can find our angle, that we can find that unique approach that's going to be valuable, that's still going to be data backed, but it's going to rely a bit more on qualitative data. So that's what I want to walk through right now, is walk through two different ways to really gather qualitative data for content research that can really help us find, if we know what topics we want to cover, how do we find this angle that's going to be really exciting and resonate for people? So my first one, SEO can be really esoteric. It can be kind of weird if it's not your space. But the reality is Google, every time you Google something, they're showing you exactly what people want. And they're giving you a rank order list of what they think is best. So, unlike a lot of things, they are showing their hand all the time for one. And all of us are also super familiar with search results. Just because you haven't spent, or perhaps misspent, a lifetime looking at search results doesn't mean you're not totally capable of assessing them. And that's one of the beautiful things that I love about sort of a search engine results page or SERP analysis, is that it's really, really accessible. If you are a C-suiter and you get really annoyed with all the spreadsheets that you get, this is a great way for someone to be able to kind of create a narrative that's going to make sense at all levels. If you are that person creating those spreadsheets and you're frustrated that you don't feel like you're getting buy-in for your ideas, the search engine results page is this great place with this sort of shared, very visceral understanding that we all have because we've all spent so much time looking at search results. So we're going to walk through a quick breakdown of what we could do here. Say we've decided that our topic that is super, super valuable to us is beach checklist. This is the space that we're going to own. Maybe we're, a beach retailer and we sell, products at a beach. This is really what we know best. So we're going to do, what does the search result look like? What is it trying to tell us? How can it help us find that unique angle? So the first thing it tells us is tons and tons and tons of clicks are flowing directly through image search, right? So there's absolutely no way I would ever even think about producing content on this that didn't have sort of a PDF or a PNG file, something super visual in it that was kind of like, give me something I can print sort of scenario. The other things, the two other things I would take away from this, one, Image search, you can see already there, what probably has like 15 or 20 results in there. That's already more than there are blue links on the page. So image search already means that this search result's gonna be a little bit more open. There are more spaces to get in here to kind of like get our way into this search result, even if we're not one of the blue links on there. And then also, as I start thinking about designing this content, what this should look like, you can notice it's a lot of white on those images. There's like sort of a consistent kind of aquamarine color. If you came in with a super like bright red image, bright green image, something else, your colors could probably pop in here. And I don't think people are really looking at this as a rank order list, right? It's looking at it as kind of a single block. So there's potential here right away where I would say organically, hey, if we can design something that really catches the eye and it's a really great size, well done image, that's a great way really quickly to come in and differentiate yourself and get these clicks in the search result. The second thing you can kind of see is sort of already been optimized to death. So there are some like telltale signs of classic SEO work here, classic content marketing work too, for better or worse. It's like the ultimate, anything that starts with the ultimate, people have gone the skyscraper route down the skyscraper route before, the sort of ultimate of ultimate. My favorite one here is that 2 people are claiming it's the only beach checklist you'll need. So I'm really waiting for like the battle royale between these 2 websites to figure out which one is actually the only one I need. And you can also see a little in the brackets, the 2021 edition, classic SEO, sort of little ploy where you're reminding search engines, hey, look, we just updated this. This is brand new. You should keep it up on page 1. So the takeaway from something like this, where I see something that's already been optimized to death, is that I know that there's not, some basic on-page SEO optimizations. They're going to be table stakes. They're not going to be the kind of things that are going to be like, oh, if I just create a really optimized article, that's going to get me to page 1, the top of page 1 right away. Not going to happen. So that's just good learning as far as it's going to be table stakes, but that's not going to be the differentiator. So we can't expect that, if setting expectations, that's going to really matter for us. One of the interesting things about this, we've talked about expertise, but in particular, the type of expertise the search engine results page is showing us. So when you look at some of the top ranking sites, often we expect to see really big websites because these are websites that have a lot of links pointing to them, which means they have a lot of credibility, which means Google likes to show them really high in search results. But really, most of these are travel bloggers, and they're somewhat, I guess, kind of well-known travel bloggers, but they're still travel bloggers. You see Eagle Creek, a retailer of outdoor stuff, sneaks in there. But I would have guessed, if you would ask me to guess blind who would have ranked first, like high up in the search result, I would have tell you, like probably like Travelocity or Kayak or Orbitz, like these travel sites that logically would think to do this stuff, even though they didn't have what Google's really rewarding here, which is that experiential expertise. So Google's really looking for people that have actually done this traveling, even if they take like kind of cheesy Instagram photos about their perfect travel lives, not to speak. But that's something that we're really seeing this search result, which for me means if I'm somebody like Eagle Creek and maybe kind of on the outside, where I'm not actually doing this all the time, it's just relevant for me, I probably got to think about niching down to somewhere where I'm more relevant, because Google's clearly not looking for tons of kind of what you might call third parties to jump into the search result. They're really rewarding people who are actually doing this stuff. So one of the ways that maybe you can niche down is maybe we choose the geographic location where we are. Or if you go back and look at that image search, what you'll see is that there are some filters in that image search where you can click through like toddler or family. Maybe if I'm a bespoke retailer of kids swimwear, that I know that, hey, maybe this is the angle that I can take that's going to make me a little bit more relevant, rather than trying to compete at this highest level where I'm probably not going to fit in. The last thing that I would sort of take away from this is that honestly, compared to like a your money or your life query, one of the healthcare or finance queries, Google really isn't asking for all that much. The classic sort of skyscraper thing would say, oh, first things first, you got to write 5,000 words on this. That's baseline. And the reality is that stuff's on page 1 here. It's really just a checklist. In some cases, not even HTML copy. It's really just a checklist that's out there. So I wouldn't spend a bunch of time and money and energy writing and writing and writing and writing when it's not going to get me anywhere. And then also what you have to notice when you click through a couple of the top search results, this one here, every single link on that page takes you to an Amazon search results page. So this is a complete affiliate play where basically they're trying to get traffic so that you click the link, buy the thing on Amazon, and they get a kickback from Amazon. That's not editorial impartiality, right? That's somebody who's trying to sort of maximize the value of where they happen to sit in search results. So if Google really, really cared about this, they wouldn't elevate those kind of sites that are doing that, right? If you're asking questions about over-the-counter pharmaceuticals, they're not going to let affiliate sites run in there and push you toward buying a certain brand. So the stakes here are relatively low. So if I'm thinking again, what's my angle? And my initial thought might have been like, oh, I'm going to do this super comprehensive deep dive on the type of sunscreen you should be using based on the UV index of where you're going to go. That's not the kind of thing that I see Google caring about right now. So you can either say, okay, we're going to get way out in front of this and hope this works for us, or you can say, maybe we don't need to do this right now. Maybe the shortest path is, again, choosing that kind of like high intensity graphic that maybe if we can catch people's eye in image search, then maybe we want to bring them back into a certain type of content that we feel is going to really resonate with what we think is on brand for us. Now, that's kind of one way to do it. The other way to do it that I really love that can really help you understand more is to use comment sections to get to the why. And when we think about quantitative versus qualitative data, typically quantitative data is going to give us the what. It's going to give us the raw numbers. So it might tell us we have 500 links to this post or 1,000 social shares. It's going to tell us absolutely nothing about why we got 500 links or 1,000 social shares. Those tend to devolve into what we call a narrative fallacy, of where we kind of look at it and think, oh, I bet it got these social shares because of this, which sometimes may be right, sometimes may be obvious, sometimes may be completely wrong. So again, if you're living off this purely quantitative approach to sort of finding your angle, you're going to be left with trying to guess, trying to speculate at why this stuff got attention. And there are ways in these comment sections, especially on sites that use kind of an upvoting system, to really get to the why. And so one example, it's great if you're in B2B, is Hacker News. So we're going to talk about unlimited vacation. Say we're doing HR software. This makes a lot of sense for us. This is right in our wheelhouse, talking about benefits packages and these kind of policies. Drop a keyword like this in the Hacker News. It's going to give you the articles that rank. So quickly, you can even just look at the titles of the articles. And because it's upvoted, you're going to see the most popular articles. You're going to be able to say, okay, here's the kind of articles that resonate. But we still might be left with a little bit of that sort of speculative, narrative fallacy, because we're saying, okay, maybe the way it was framed, like this is why it got popular. But this is absolutely what I love about these sites. You can click through the comments. The comments themselves are also upvoted. So they've done all the work for you. So instead of in a traditional blog where there might be, say, 20 comments, and you're trying to guess which of those comments 95% of people agreed with, which of those comments 95% of people thought were really stupid, and it's really hard to do. Hacker News is going to straight up tell you, hey, this comment got the most upvotes. So we know that there's sort of this consensus in the community that this is the kind of stuff that they were thinking about. So you can start to go through and just kind of catalog some of these comments in a spreadsheet, just dropping these into individual cells. And you see things like, okay, well, there's no reason companies couldn't do both, right? Somebody's saying you can have this paid compensated X number of days time, but you can also take days on top of that. You just won't be compensated for them. So that's one kind of proposed solution here. Somebody else saying, look, the way they're wording this is just terrible, because obviously you can't take 365 days off, but really you can't take 200, 150, maybe not even 20. So there's critique again of like, it's just terrible word choice because it's setting these expectations that clearly don't exist. And there's this other comment that got upvoted a lot that was kind of interesting of like, oh, hey, did you know that financial companies actually force everybody once a year to take 2 weeks off so they can see if all of a sudden the numbers change a whole lot when you're gone because you've been doing something kind of shady. So you can do this on Hacker News. It's great for B2B. Reddit is absolutely great for everything else. So no matter what the topic is, you can find the same kind of stuff. So we looked at Reddit too for the same unlimited vacation topic. Found this old article from Netflix, but still had some great relevant comments. Right, this somebody clearly loves unlimited vacation policies, and their critique here was that number one, it's supposed to be counted against compensation, so you should be compensated for it. And number two, that amount of time off is built on an expectation of how much work you're supposed to get done. So if you're supposed to get everything done except for maybe 10 days off, what are the odds you can really take more time? So the outcome of this is you're going to put this, you drop this stuff into a spreadsheet. The wonderful thing about this is it's really scalable. So if you have time to collect 50 snippets, great. You can collect 200, great. Either one's going to work and help feed the approach that you take to how you go about this topic. And you go into, you can just code this as qualitative data. And qualitative coding, it's a pretty intuitive process. You're just going to go through and kind of tag these. Okay, what's the theme here? Once you go through 20 or 30, what you'll find is that even if you're just kind of tagging inconsistently, you'll see like, oh, these 3 or 4 tags are actually almost the same. We can just kind of combine these. And you'll end up with a fair number of themes that kind of coalesce as you go through the whole group. Once you have this, you can then look at those themes and say, okay, here we go. I'm going to build these codes into themes, and I'm going to map these on the potential topics that I could cover. So one of the themes we might come out from this data is, hey, unlimited is just a terrible choice of words. It's sort of setting this up for failure. So one, the language creates this immediate mismatch. And then we also know that the pre-unlimited vacation work expectations shape that real potential. So we know that, depending on when this policy was implemented, there were probably some pre-existing expectations that really define how successful this policy is. So again, with this as kind of one theme, I can then pitch a great article idea if I'm this HR software, which is 5 questions to quantify how many days unlimited vacation actually means. So we're leaning into this skepticism already. We're already kind of reaching out to that audience that's skeptical of this. And then we're going to provide them with strategies on how to figure out what it really means, which makes a whole lot of sense for an HR company, software company, right? Because this might be for people transitioning between jobs. And we can empower them with questions like, why don't you ask when they implemented their unlimited vacation policy and how many days they had before that? Because if they did this a year ago and before that they had 10 days, I wouldn't expect any more than 10 days. If they had 30 days, it might mean 30. But we've dug through enough of these comments to have a sense of, oh, here's how we can help provide this information. At the same time, this kind of potential article not showing up in keyword research. It's not going to show up in most linked. It's not going to show up in most shared. But we know this is a really data-driven approach, right? We're still using this qualitative data, but we're really getting access to some of that why, some of the stuff that really gets people excited or fired up. That's going to give us this potential to create an article and take an angle, take an opinion, take a stance on that. That's going to help resonate in sort of this sea of long form content where otherwise we're just going to get drowned out with everybody else who's looking at the exact same data from the exact same tools on shares, links, and very little else. Now, that might sound like a whole lot of fun, but then the question is, okay, great. If I have my topic, if I have the angle that I want to approach, how on earth do I scale this in a way that's going to make sense? Because there are some people out there who are saying, I need 100 topics to go through by tomorrow because we have an army of freelancers or in-house writers. There are other people who are saying, we're going to be lucky if we can publish once a month, and we need help sort of framing that for what we're doing and for actually being able to win and be successful with that, no matter what that cadence looks like. So the first thing I want to kind of ask, and this is a question that probably none of us have asked, is a blog actually right for your business? Have you ever asked, would you ever actually choose a blog for your site, for your business, unless it happened to be preloaded into your CMS? The whole term of blog was actually, it came out in 1999 by this guy who gets credit for coming up with the term blog, who shortened it as a joke from weblog at the time. But what you can see is this is the historical, like what we think of as blogs is like, this is kind of this guy's personal diary, right? Like it's his personal diary, it's sequential, he publishes kind of when he wants. This isn't super well cited stuff. This is kind of, rando's opinion on the internet. This doesn't really make sense for enterprise B2B software or even like necessarily a digital marketing agency, but we're sort of stuck with this. We just sort of fall into it because every CMS comes preloaded to it with it. And it creates a lot of expectation, it creates a lot of challenge for our content marketing programs that kind of gets us out of whack really quickly with how we can really manage and sustain our work. So the first thing I want to kind of like, again, let us off the hook for, you are probably the only person who is aware of how often you publish. I would bet that no one else outside of your company knows how often you publish, even though I know internally the experience of that tends to be, oh my gosh, we haven't published a blog post in 3 weeks, we've got to get something up. No one else notices, no one else. So the first thing to sort of step back from that is really to kind of take that perspective from the person outside, not to obsess over what is inside, even though I know it's really, really hard to do, but there are sort of negative consequences for us getting so obsessed on that publishing cadence. And I want to highlight an article that was 4 or 5 years ago from Jimmy Daly that was just great and still very influential, is blogs are libraries, not publications. And the outcome of this is really thinking less about that sequential nature of a blog, even if you keep technically a blog on your CMS, thinking less about that sequential nature of publishing and more about building these kind of resource hubs, these library of materials that really, really make sense for what you're doing, regardless of the frequency of that publishing, regardless of whether you publish 3 in 1 month and then nothing for a month. The other thing that this really has a big impact on, that really changes the influence and the perspective, is it should really have us focus on updating the content that we have. Because the reality is, again, we're a library. We're not what we just published last month. We're what we published for all time that is still live on our website. So we're accountable for that. And for many people, that's their first and only experience with our brand, is coming in through that. And that's part of the point he makes here is, so few blogs are read the way they used to. So few people are like, oh, I'm going to check in on so-and-so's blog and just look for every time there's a new post, or I'm going to sign up for an RSS feed. That's not the way that most people consume content. For the most part, it's getting it out there, and then people are finding it kind of at will when they do find it via search results, which means we might think that we just revamped our content strategy, that everything we've been doing the last 6 months is just great, is phenomenal, is well-designed, everything. But if 90% of our site traffic is organic traffic to stuff we published 5 years ago that we've totally forgotten about, that has broken images and broken links and is off-brand, that's really what the majority of our brand experience is. That's really what the majority of our content experience is. And that's really what our content brand is that it's not so much what are we doing now or what have we done recently, it's what are people discovering most often, and like it or not, that is what our content brand is. So getting out of this mindset of the sequential blog that we have to publish every so often is kind of the first step to really refocusing on that. Because inevitably, otherwise, we end up where we're just going to constantly kind of trade that experience of, we'll say, hey, we'd much rather just publish regularly versus publish better. And there's really, really difficult in modern times to stand out that way. Now, the other thing that's sort of that Jimmy is really great here and kind of laying us off the hook is that it's okay to belabor the point, right? We don't have to come up with what's that new topic, what's that new topic, what's the new topic next week, what's the different topic. We've already covered that topic. right? Not that we're gonna write the exact same thing every week, but I want to think about it this way. If we found that core question that we're best able to answer, what are the odds that if we're the expert, we're going to write about it once, and then we're going to forget about it and never touch it again? That makes no sense. We wouldn't think of, oh yeah, this person's an expert because they covered this one topic one time and then forgot about it. Right? Experts are people who continue to come back to this same kind of central idea, answering the same kind of question, taking different perspectives, looking at it, new historically, bringing in other people's ideas. So Jimmy really gives people here kind of like, it's okay to belabor the point. It's okay if most of what you publish kind of circles back to the same idea. It's not the exact same stuff, but those are those different angles, and those are going to really help you build that credibility. When we go back again to think about really early on, what Google looking for? Google's looking for experts. Experts are going to be those people they can find. If Google can see that, oh hey, they're really honing in, looking at sort of from a topical perspective on this one topic through sort of 20 different lenses or 20 different subtopics or whatever it's going to be, that's really how you're going to be successful, especially when you're competing against really, really big websites, especially when you're the small fry, you're competing against the really big ones. Google has consistently and increasingly been better at rewarding those really kind of niche providers who are the ones that are really focusing in. So that's, again, the permission. You get permission to sort of publish randomly because people are encountering you randomly via search, and then also to kind of really centralize and hone in on that topic. Now, a big question to kind of think about here, even as we talk about breaking apart from the blog structure, there is one thing that you can kind of keep in mind here is, are you going to benefit more from the awareness work or that thought leadership work? Because there are some different implications when it comes to kind of how often you maybe could or should publish. If you're in that awareness space, it's probably going to mean you're going to publish more often, and it's maybe going to be a little bit less innovative in your content because you're trying to reach a really big audience, which means you are going to be motivated to maybe cover a few different topics because you're going to be trying to get to a broad swath of people that are looking at lots of different things. So often this makes more sense for if you're in B2C or if you have really short sales cycles in B2B. The differentiations we're going to look at in just a second really comes via a consistent standard executed at scale. That's where you differentiate. You're not going to differentiate on like, oh my gosh, this is this totally novel approach to something. It's going to be the fact that you become this really consistent, reliable resource for people. And that's a much more process-driven kind of approach. And it's also, it is going to rely a little bit more on search, right? Because we're trying to reach this really big audience. Pretty much most sites out there, they get the lion's share of their content from organic search because it's this really great and wonderful and sort of free distribution channel if you don't count all the work that you have to put in to show up in search results. On the flip side, if you do need that thought leadership, you're going to be a little more innovative and you're published a little less often. Jimmy Daly's piece on, your blog is a publication, is a library, not a publication. That's a great example of that kind of thought leadership content. It doesn't have a keyword target. It's, the kind of outcome of a lot of his work, but it really, really resonated, and it's still something that people cite consistently. So it's going to make a lot more sense if you're in like a longer B2B sales cycle. You're really trying to kind of like capture that mind share. It's really, really common in service industries. So again, if we take ourselves as an example, we're not going to be able to show people what differentiates Workshop Digital from other marketing agencies if we're just cranking out tons of 101 SEO, PPC, how-to content, because everybody has that. It's everywhere. How is it any different? The way we're going to succeed is by trying to focus more on, hey, we're going to create content that we're going to publish occasionally, but it's going to help highlight the way that we're thinking about problems and challenges and finding solutions a little bit differently than other people. So again, it's going to be more differentiated by that kind of new perspective or opinions. And the other kind of priority that we'll put is going to put that priority of, hey, we might want to build this audience over having that search potential. So it might matter more to us that something resonates on social media, or that we can provide something really awesome via email to our email list than it does that this has X number of searches per month. As we'll see, of course, that's not really an either or, it's more of a spectrum to keep in mind. I do want to touch on really quickly this idea of sort of differentiating content at scale through consistent execution. The test that I like to use for this is kind of called the Abe Lincoln Test. So I'm going to give you a second. If you Google Abe Lincoln biography, here's the result set that you get. Just take a second, look at these, think about which one you would click. I'm going to take a sip of tea here. Now, what I want to know is when you if you had a response like, oh, totally clicking that one, why did you decide to click it? Is it, you're like, I clicked the first result no matter what, I don't have time for anything else? That could be your reason. It could be you click Britannica because you have memories of the print encyclopedias. And so there you can see there's this brand that they built in print that they've now carried over into digital. Could be Wikipedia because like Wikipedia is just your go-to source, it's easy to use. Whatever it is, that's that kind of differentiation that these sites have built by having consistent scaled execution. So that's the kind of thing that we talk about, like what I think about as a great win, if you're really doing content at scale that's built for awareness, is what are the adjectives that people would use to describe your website, the content on your website? If you said, hey, random blog visitor, what do you think of when you think of content on whatever.com? If they think of, I don't have any associations, that means you haven't done it. If they're like, oh, it's always like long form, it's always super well researched, and they always have these really cool graphics. Well, now all of a sudden you start to recognize what that content brand is that you've been able to execute at scale, and you can make sure you kind of protect that and build on that as well. So that's what it means when we talk about really executing that kind of content brand at scale. And again, it's not on this spectrum, or sorry, it's on this spectrum. It's really not an either or. So I want to give another example here of what it kind of looks like to shade in between that awareness and that thought leadership perspective. So the classic like awareness play, if we talk about, say, like an SEO roundup article, is we're just going to talk like send a one-line survey to 50 people. They're going to all fill it out. We're just going to dump all their answers in a stream. We're not going to connect any of them. We're not going to tell you that like, oh, answer 14 is actually in direct contradiction to answer 37. This could be a really cool conversation. We're going to dump them all in there and forget about it. That's the very base level awareness play. It's keyword targeted. They've built in a lot of potential outreach to these people that they've included, even though there's not really any compelling reason to get involved. The flip side is one that we did here where we basically had a series of questions that we sent to 15 people. And then we got these back in email form, but then we built them into a narrative. So we actually wanted to find the people who were in dialogue with each other. And we built this whole thing around what we thought were like 6 or 7 key questions for building an agency. So there were things like, how did you land your first big client? Or how did you build a marketing program that went beyond just getting referrals? How did you manage to scale your teams effectively? Like these kind of like big moments in agency life. And then we kind of push these into a narrative. So technically, is it still a roundup? Yeah, kind of. But for CXL and the kind of content that we produce, we didn't want to do that base level version. We knew that we kind of had to do something that's going to be on brand for us, which absolutely was including experts, but it wasn't just sort of dumping them in there. It was really trying to tackle the second level, the advanced level questions. So again, there are plenty of ways you can kind of scale this depending on what your resources are, depending on what makes sense for your brand. You can do kind of the same research and have some different outcomes based on what you're able to do. Now, the last thing I want to talk about that can really help, especially if you're starting out, as far as kind of scaling your resources to what you can do. If you can create heroes in the content that you create, you'll make distribution so much easier. Distribution is really, really hard. And it's kind of one of the core things of how do we get this in front of people, even if it's amazing. Just because it's amazing doesn't mean it's going to get there. If you can create heroes, if you can think about the people who we'd really love to get to share this or talk about this, if we can make them the centerpiece and the hero, it's going to be so much easier. You're not going to ask for them to share because they're just going to do it. And so an example from a few years ago, I wrote this article just for giggles, and basically was kind of doing a novel statistical approach to look at what kind of content was most successful for sites, kind of based on where that site was in its lifetime. So again, trying to add a little bit of context. One of the outcomes of this was there are basically 2 agencies. I looked at about 30 different sites. There are 2 agencies that are absolutely crushing it right now. And so that was in the write-up. And sure enough, one of the people who ran one of those agencies, who's sort of a well-known person on Twitter, Mark Traphagen, cited this. He didn't cite it because I asked him to, or because he thought it was like cool. He cited it because I said that his agency, Stone Temple Consulting, was kicking ass, right? So I was able to make a hero out of this, and it sort of naturally, this is what he is sitting at his desk begging that somebody will publish content that will help explain why it is that his agency is so great and differentiated, and everybody should be paying attention to them. And we basically create this for him, and all of a sudden it's a really easy lift. So this is the kind of thing you can think about. And this is like a small example because we're looking at basically 30 websites, but this is absolutely the thing that we can scale. And so if you really want to kind of talk about next level for that, then it's scaling that, which is often really successful when you're doing it with original research. So Emily Byford on her personal website just created a couple years ago, the state of SaaS content marketing. 500 SaaS companies pulled maybe a dozen different metrics about how often they were publishing, what kind of success they were having based on some available data from third-party tools. If you talk about 500 SaaS companies, you can say the top 50, right? All of a sudden you have 50 people who you can immediately celebrate as you guys are doing awesome with this. You are among the top companies out there. You're really crushing it, right? You've created 50 heroes that immediately can really help support this distribution. And you can do this at an even larger scale than that. And so a lot of us think about, if you've ever seen like the US News and World Report, best colleges, best places to live, whatever else, usually we look at this like, okay, they're US News and World Report. They have tons of editorial resources. I'm sure they had like a huge team of data scientists doing all this original research. When you look behind the scenes of this stuff, the fault that we have as content marketers isn't that we're not doing a good job. It's usually that we are over-engineering what we really have to get this out there. US News and World Report, they build this report off 11 metrics. 7 of those you could go download from census.gov or Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS.gov in a half hour. So you're already like 70% there of what they are doing is this foundational, incredibly important, 150 best places to live research. Two others are their own data sets, one on schools and one on hospitals. So two others they just built internally themselves. Another they bought. So if you got a little bit of a budget to say spend $500 on a data set. And the last thing they did was a 3,000 person survey monkey survey about where people wanted to live. That's not going to pass scientific muster, but that is the entirety of, that's all the data that they have to build these. And you can see like very quickly, geography is a great way to scale, right? They have 150 cities that are gonna be super psyched to be on this list, that absolutely their chamber of commerce, their local publications, their local newspapers are all going to be citing this, are all going to be sharing this. And all they had to do was gather these 11 metrics, most of which any of us could go out and get today. The one thing I will say about this when it comes to original research that is kind of like a little hack with this, do some little bit of data gathering yourself of like a survey. Even if it's not the most comprehensive survey, what this does, it means that no one else can replicate the results because everything else that they put in there is basically available to anybody. But because they did this survey that they're not sharing with anybody else, all of a sudden they're getting a different result set than anybody. So anytime you're thinking about doing a research project, absolutely simplify it. Find 5 metrics, limit yourself. Make sure one of those is something that you've gathered yourself so that you can say nobody else can have this data set because we're using some little bit of proprietary information in it. And that can make a really, really big difference. But you can see 150 heroes they've created out of this. Anytime you're gonna look at geography to scale, it's really, really quick. A quick way to create tons and tons and tons of heroes. Now, I admittedly have gone the wrong way with this. We did an amazing study years ago, had 38 unique metrics. It had an intense weighting system. This is one of the weighting systems to rank e-commerce distribution locations. This took 6 months to do ultimately. We could have done it with a third of the data in 2 months and got it out much more inexpensively. So again, the barrier often for creating this kind of original research that's really great to create those heroes, to support distribution, especially when you don't have any kind of existing audience, we're overcomplicating it. Simplify it, force yourself to do it in 5 metrics, force yourself to do it with 7 metrics, whatever it is, force yourself to gather whatever data you can gather in 2 days, 4 days, a week, whatever it is. You're going to have what you need, especially if you have one little proprietary bit. And then make sure that the way that you're framing this, the outcome of that is going to be some number of heroes that you can create with your content. The more, the better. Even if you don't have any kind of audience, what is that thing that people are super stoked to share? Who's sitting at their desk right now wishing someone would come up with some kind of report that would showcase them in that light? So again, takeaways, choose topics at the heart of your expertise. What is that one question you can answer? There might be 10 that you could, but what's that one question you can answer that you really start with? And then make sure at the same time, then we can use that search data to decide, okay, well, how do we make sure we get this in front of people? We have the topic. What are the expectations we can expect from search? Do we have another distribution channel that we can use to support this? The second, for creating that authoritative brand building content. One, quantitative data not coming to save us, nor are our 10,000 word long form things anymore. They're not going to give us that unique approach. That qualitative data is really going to help us find out what people care about this topic, what generates that emotional response that we can then use to reframe the way that we approach it so that it's unique, so that it resonates, so that it gets us either to the top of search results, the top of inboxes, the top of social media, whatever it is that's going to give us that perspective. And then lastly, when it comes to shaping these efforts kind of within the bounds of what we can do, right? First, sort of like to admit it, to have the moment where we're like, look, we have a blog because we have a CMS. We didn't start with nothing and then decide to do this. Know that this, awareness, it's not awareness first thought leadership so much as it's, that spectrum between awareness and thought leadership. And to think about where we are right now, the type of business we are, we might kind of lean one way. It might be forever that way because of the business we are. It might be that way right now. It might be something where we have enough resources where we can do a little bit of both. And then to try to create those heroes, as many as possible, to really scale that distribution, no matter big, small, whatever it is. And that is about as much as I can say in 50 minutes. So I'd love if people have any questions here. I'm happy to answer what I can. I'm going to look for the questions in the chat. I don't see any in the chat. Any questions, unless I'm missing them, Andrew, who's helping me right now?
Yeah, one came in from Amber. Can you give us an example of experiential expertise?
Sure. Experiential expertise for me would be somebody who's actually done it. This was a big thing that at CXL we like to really focus on. For example, we talked a lot about digital marketing, but we were always trying to get information from practitioners. So I would differentiate that from if you're a freelancer who maybe is really good as a generalist and can research this stuff, you might be able to write about it, but you don't really have that experiential expertise. And it makes a huge difference, even though those differences are often subtle. often what we found is people who have experiential expertise, people who are the practitioners, they really understand the nuances of topics. They really add that really granular detail in a way that a freelancer kind of glosses over something because they don't quite have that depth of knowledge. So experiential expertise is especially great if you're trying to create content that sort of counters prevailing wisdom or counters best practices, because those experts have actually done the work are the ones who say, like, look, best practices documents will tell you this, here's how it works in the real world. And that's the kind of stuff that often you really want to be really, really good for helping to differentiate.
Another question from Basant, hope I got your name right. What type of content could e-commerce websites work on to increase organic traffic?
Yeah, well, that's certainly a big question. I would say that, often, and Andrew and I have talked about this internally for ourselves, which is the hard part is like the blue sky moment is kind of the hardest part. So I would say, depending on how diverse your kind of product portfolio is, to really think about getting small. It's much, much easier to start with a really centralized topic. Like, say your e-commerce site, sells socks. Like, you probably shouldn't be talking about things other than socks. You could be talking about clothing generally, whatever else. You should be focusing in on socks, keeping care of your feet, whatever that might be. Start small, start as concentrated as you can, and then you can always expand later. But it works much, much better, especially for search, to really zoom in on that really, really small expertise. Even if when you're jumping into some of these keyword research tools, it looks like it's a lot of stuff that has between 0 and 10 searches. When there's so many collectively of these long tail queries, they can really add up and in some really be valuable for you over time. But yeah, it's always gonna be tempting to sort of expand that expertise, bring it down as small as possible, where you really know that, again, those places where you do have, to go back to the other question, that experiential expertise. If you haven't done it, if you don't have people on staff that can talk about it from their experience working on it, it's probably outside of where your wheelhouse is right now.
Yeah, great question. Another one from Varun. Is it correct to say that choosing or developing a topic is still an intuitive approach? And maybe one way of thinking about that is, can the machines replace the human intuition yet in developing and finalizing topics?
No, absolutely not. This is one of the things that's like, great. We are not about to be out of jobs. And I think, the temptation, and certainly I've had it, is to try to solve for this stuff quantitatively. And there are certain ways that I intentionally kind of skipped over today where you can improve some of the quantitative data that you have. You can get a little bit smarter about using quantitative data. But absolutely, I think about quantitative data as being a means to sort of like, it's an initial test to get in the gate. It's an initial way to kind of validate some ideas at a very high level. But all the sort of refinement to really find that unique angle is going to come from that qualitative data. So even if, say, you started with a quantitative data set of, say, the top 5,000 articles that earn the most social shares or links, something really, really basic like that. Once they pass a certain threshold, like you said, you only want to look at the stuff that earned at least like 50 links, then I would just throw out the numbers. I wouldn't even pay attention anymore. I would start looking at those titles, start driving through those topics and seeing what are the themes that I, using my brain qualitatively, look and see that resonate here, and not fuss over the fact of like, oh, this article got 100 links, but this one only got 25, so therefore I should spend all my time with the one that got 100. We never know whether it got 100 because 75 of those are spammy, or they purchased those, or they had a really strong outreach campaign. So those smaller quantitative differences aren't usually that indicative of the actual content quality. So I would totally lean into that. Lean into using your brain. Lean into using the qualitative data if you need to have kind of some of a data backbone there. But we probably spent way too much time as an industry obsessing over really, really bad and limited quantitative data.
Yeah, great answer. We got a question from Isaiah. There will be a recording. I'm going to send it out over email. So if you registered for this event, you should be on our email list, and I will send out a link as soon as we get that edited down. So keep an eye out for that. Also a question from Ed. Hey, Ed, good to see you. Should we put the same articles into all channels, or do we need different articles in different channels, like a blog versus your LinkedIn or your Instagram? So it's a distribution question. How do you combine those two?
Yeah, I mean, any smart person will tell you to get kind of the max value out of the content you create. Usually, there's sort of, that would be the sort of least effort way would be to be doing something similar to a copy and paste. I think the reality is that obviously we know that different channels, people kind of have different needs. If you're on Instagram, people are going to want something that's, a few visual takeaways probably, even if that's just, text on kind of a colored background, versus LinkedIn, they may want a certain format. It's also about what those channels reward. Like LinkedIn really rewards discussions. So maybe there's a way you can extract some small part of that that's going to kind of catalyze a discussion on that platform. Whereas in search, you may say that I want to keep kind of a long form version of this because search engines do still kind of love text. So if you already have a few thousand words written on this, it makes sense to keep it there. but it's, I would think mostly about where that audience is, how that audience typically interacts with content on that platform. And again, what's the sort of lowest effort way to translate that? And sometimes, to be honest, and I totally admit to this, like sometimes it's like all you can do is pull a few snippets from an article and push them out on social, where it's like, we have 10 different key takeaways that we wrote in this article that's like a 10-point listicle. We're going to post one of those on social every day. And that's kind of a baseline starting point. That comes back to like, sure, there's some hypothetical perfect way to do this, and then the rest of us in the real world have to find some way to work on it. So I would always say any kind of incremental improvement that you can do is great. So if the incremental improvement is posting a snippet of it on LinkedIn, because otherwise the option is it doesn't exist on LinkedIn at all, do that. If 6 months from now, a year from now, then you have the capacity to kind of like reframe it a bit for discussion, and you have somebody on your staff to help moderate that conversation, inspire it, then you do that. But the sort of all or nothing approach can certainly kill off what could otherwise be a lot of really good progress.